Hey, hi everybody. Welcome to a Coffee Talk with Mac. It's Wednesday night. And on my last segment, we talked about the need for term limits and why it's so important that we need to have a constitutional amendment for term limits. Well, tonight I want to talk about the need for campaign finance reform and why it's out of control. And we can't rely, again, we can't rely on the swamp, on Washington, D.C. career politicians to fix the problem. Just like we can't rely on them to fix the problem with term limits, they will never fix the problem with campaign finance control or reform. Okay, so tonight's segment brought to you by Pete's. I got Pete's there. Okay, Pete's was founded by Alfred Pete, 1966 in Berkeley, California. He opened up a small coffee shop, and it's right now it is my favorite coffee. And this one was roasted on August 8th. So the sooner you drink coffee with a small roasting window, the better. So it's roasted on August 8th, and it's good to go. If you're buying regular mass-produced coffee, it could be sitting on a shelf for 6 months to a year, maybe in a warehouse somewhere. You have no idea. This is organic coffee, certified organic, and as the roast on date there. So have a cup of coffee. Tonight's brought to you by Pete's. I like Pete's. Not sponsored because I don't get paid for this. I just enjoy drinking coffee, and I like to share with you my enjoyment of drinking coffee and the coffee that I enjoy. Okay, so let's not have a mistake there. I'm not being sponsored by anybody. I enjoy the coffee. So tonight we're talking about campaign finance reform and the need for it, and the fact that we can't rely on politicians to do it. Right now, the money is out of control. You and I personally have limits of how much we could contribute to a campaign each year, right? We have limits, but there's no limits for PACs. There's no limits for, doesn't appear to be limits for corporations. There's money flowing around all over, left and right, and it seems like every candidate has some type of foundation, and the foundation gets donations, and then and money goes to run the foundation, and then that foundation makes a donation to another entity, and that's how the money's laundered. Okay, give you a typical example. In New York State, when many years ago, the Attorney General filed a lawsuit against Big Tobacco, right? They had a press release, so they made a settlement. It never went to court. They made a settlement. Big Tobacco agreed to pay so much to the state, plus make donations to certain funds, okay, around the state. Those funds in turn contributed to the governorship campaign of that former attorney general. That was Eliot Spitzer. So that's how the money funneled around. That's how they did the end around game. Okay, so as an attorney general, he used this position to get money from Big Tobacco. Part of the deal was they contributed to certain funds, organizations around the state. Those organizations in turn made donations to the political committees of Democratic political committees, Act Blue and others, which in turn gave money to Eliot Spitzer for his run for the governorship. So that's how money is funneled around. That's how they use loopholes and everything. So this needs to be fixed, and there was a report in Newsweek. There was an article in Newsweek sometime in the early 80s, I believe it was, or late 70s, early 80s, after Abscam came out, and they interviewed an FBI agent on a corruption task force. And he said, there's so much corruption in Washington that if they locked up every politician for corruption that they were investigating for corruption, there'd be no politicians left to run the country. That's how much corruption there was, especially in the 70s in Washington, D.C. Hopefully it's changed a little bit, but there's a reason why politicians, they go in broke, they come out rich. Follow the money. Where's that money coming from? How does somebody go in on the verge of bankrupt as an individual, and then they come out a millionaire, 2 years later, 4 years later, 6 years later, 12 years later? So just follow the money. There's money being exchanged left and right. It may be 6 degrees of separation, but you got to follow the money. So I'm going to share a clip of a short segment. It was a TED Talk, and it was really enlightening. So we're going to watch it.
So it turns out exactly a year ago, right now, right this minute, a year ago in Hong Kong, an extraordinary protest began. Protest begun by students, literally high school and college students, elementary school students. Then their parents felt a little embarrassed that they had let the kids work so hard. The parents showed up as well. And the protest was about a law. And the law was proposed by China. The law was to determine how the governor of Hong Kong would be selected. And the law said the ultimate aim was the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. Okay, so the idea was there's a two-step process. The first step was nomination, and then the second step was an election. And the nominating committee would be comprised of about 1,200 people, which means out of 7 million people, that is 0.02% of Hong Kong. All right, now 0.02%, as you can see, is a really tiny number, right? Really, really small. If you thought about it relative to all the people in Hong Kong, it would look something like this. This tiny little corner is 0.02%. So 0.02% get to pick the candidates that the rest of Hong Kong gets to vote among, and the protest.
Sound familiar? I mean, this is what happens in our two-party system, where the parties, especially in incumbent parties in areas that you can't get one party out, they control who the people get to pick. Okay, so the party committee is actually making a decision of who you get to choose. So you're not really choosing a candidate you think you're choosing. You're choosing somebody after they filtered it down to you.
Was because the fear was this filter would be a biased filter. The claim was that the 0.02% would be dominated by a pro-Beijing business and political elite. So 99.98% would be excluded from this critical first step, with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to China only. Okay, now it turns out the Chinese stole this idea from America. Don't worry, there was no patent or copyright, so there's no IP violations going on here, but they stole the idea from an American, maybe the greatest political philosopher in America, a man named Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed, the head of the Tammany Hall
Those in New York would know about Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed controlled the Democratic Party in New York City, and Boss Tweed basically said he doesn't care who the people choose, just as long as I do the selecting of who they get to choose. And it was rampant corruption at that time.
Political party used to say, I don't care who does the electing as long as I get to do the nominating. So this conception, this kind of conception of politics has an obvious logic to it, right? Because if you control the nomination, every candidate is going to worry what you, the nominator, think. So you practically control the candidate, whether or not you control the ultimate election. We can call that genius theory for destroying democracy, Tweedism. Tweedism. Any two-stage process where the Tweeds get to nominate and then the rest get to select is Tweedism, and the consequence of Tweedism, obviously, is to produce a system responsive to Tweeds only. Now, Tweedism was practiced not just in the North, not just in New York, it was practiced in the South.
So basically, that's what's happening in many cities right now, where it's hard to get out the incumbents, and because corruption and money is so embedded in localized governments that it's almost impossible to get out, because they're not, the entities that are donating, they don't care about the citizens. They just care about, supplying their candidate with money because they have an end result in mind. So let's fast forward this a little bit.
Of America. 0.02% of America dominate this first stage in the process of electing the candidates who will represent us. They pick the candidates, because you can't be credible unless you get their money, and we get to vote for those candidates. This tiny fraction of the 1%, this Chinese fraction of the 1%, dominate this first stage with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to these funders only. This Princeton study, which is a Harvard professor I'm not allowed to talk about much, so let's get it off the stage quick, by Martin Gillens and Ben Page, the largest empirical study of actual decisions by our government in the history of political science, related the actual decisions of our government over the past 40 years with the views of the economic elite, the views of organized interest groups, and the views of the average voter. And what they found was there was a nice correlation between the views of the economic elite and what our government actually did. So as you go from 0% of the elite supporting something to 100%, the probability of that proposal being passed goes up. Same thing with organized special interest groups. As the number of them supports something increases, the probability of that proposal being passed goes up. Here's the graph for the average voter. It's a flat line. Flatline, literally and figuratively. What this is saying is, as the percentage of average voters supporting a proposal goes from 0 to 100%, it doesn't change the probability that that proposal will be enacted. As they put in English, when the preferences of the economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy in a democracy.
And that's basically it in a nutshell. See, so basically, and that's why we're not going to have term limits, and we can't rely on Washington to enact term limits, because it's not in their interest to enact term limits, even though the percentage of voters who wish for and want term limits has exponentially gone up over the last 20 years. Washington's not listening. They don't care. It's a deaf ear, because who doesn't want term limits? We said this before. Organized labor doesn't want term limits. Special interest groups don't want term limits. They want to be able to groom a politician over the course of the politician's career. They don't want to have to groom a new politician every 2 years or every 6 years or every 4 years. So they provide the money, they provide the big money, what they say goes. And that's why we're not going to have term limits. And that's why it's going to be a problem. So that's why, I don't know what we have to do, but we can't rely on Washington to provide those term limits for us. Although we do have some politicians time to time come forward and propose, and they offer proposals and bills for term limits, but unfortunately never makes it to the floor. As I stated previously, Ted Cruz proposed a bill 3 separate years, 2017, 2019, and this January 2021, but never made it to the floor, even with support in 2021, never made it to the floor of the Senate. Okay, so that tells you something. Now, campaign finance reform. Who does it benefit? Okay, campaign finance reform benefits the person, the voter. Doesn't benefit the politician, doesn't benefit the special interest group, doesn't benefit the donors, doesn't benefit the PACs. So it's not going to happen. Okay, it's never going to happen. It should happen. We should demand that it happens. But just like income tax reform, it's not going to happen, because all these entities benefit politicians as is. And if you have the politician, if he can be bought, the special interest group, the PAC, the donor, the corporation, big money, big pharma, big pharmaceutical, yeah, they want to keep the politician in place. Okay, because that politician is already bought, and he's already property of somebody. So they want to keep him in place. And all it takes is one politician. Takes one politician to maybe influence maybe 2 or 3 other new politicians, and then nothing gets done. There are no changes made. So this is in relation to term limits. You want campaign finance reform? First, have to have term limits, okay? You want term limits? First, you got to drain the swamp. And that's what it comes down to. And it's a cesspool in Washington, D.C. It's definitely a cesspool. So let's not mince words here. It's full of garbage. It's like a dump, okay? It's a swamp. So we got to drain the swamp. We need new blood down there. We got to bring it back to what it was made for, okay? Where average citizen contributes to his government and then goes back to his business or his job. Get rid of the career politicians. Once you do that, you have term limits in place, then you can have campaign finance reform. Because if you have term limits, then they're not beholden to money anymore. Okay, another alternative was maybe the government should fund campaigns, but that only works if you have term limits, okay? So I don't mind the government funding campaigns when it's accountability. For Congress, you get $5 million. What's not used goes back to the Treasury, okay? And you only get to use it 3 times, 3 terms, that's it. Senator, maybe 2 terms, and you get maybe $20 million for each time you're running, but it's controlled and money not used goes back. And plus, if you limit it that way, that they're not getting it from the corporations, not getting it from big donors, not getting it from private entities, not getting it from PACs, you got to do away with that because the government's funding it. I think in the long run, it's beneficial to the voter. That's just my idea. And listen, I'd like to know what your ideas are for campaign finance reform. I'd like to know what your ideas are for term limits. How are we going to drain the swamp? How are we going to have term limits? How are we going to have term campaign finance reforms? If you have a different idea than I do, please leave it in the comments, okay? Please hit the little Fighting Irish guy and subscribe. Like this video, subscribe. Please share it with your friends. And let me know what you want to talk about on next time we meet. Okay, so thanks for joining me. We're Coffee Talk with Mac. That was just a little bit on campaign finance reform and why it's needed, and a little history about Boss Street and what's happening in Hong Kong over the last couple of years and how it mirrors what happens here in America. Okay, so like, for example, New York City, we really don't get to choose. We're told this is who you're going to choose from. That's not a real election. Okay, so campaign finance reform, we need it. If you're for it, comment. If you're against it, comment. If you have another idea, comment, like, subscribe. Thank you.